Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege, by Marilynne K. Roach, narrated by Elizabeth Wiley. Prologue. On the eve of 1692, the causes and catalysts that would ignite the Salem witchcraft trials lay scattered among hundreds of lives on 2 continents, smoldering unsuspected in the shadows of the human heart, could be discerned only by the omniscient eye of Providence or the devil's restless attention. The Prince of Air and Darkness might look upon New England and spy the flickering, unspoken thoughts of those living in the settlements. When the last cold sunset of the year 1691 reflected from such western windows as had glass, and darkness flowed in from the ocean, the wintry land below might appear peaceful. But down there in Salem Village, the fleecy backs of Tom Putnam's flock surged into the sheepfold under the watchful gaze of their owner, who had yet to notice his daughter's suicidal fear. Down there, Rebecca Nurse sat in her own home with her extended and supportive family, while Sarah Good, a few fields away, plodded on cold feet toward temporary lodging, a useless husband, and children she could hardly care for. Up country, among more prosperous farms of Andover, widowed Rebecca Johnson swept out the meeting-house and wondered if her kidnapped relatives were dead or alive. A few miles away, the discontented farmer Samuel Wardwell checked his haystacks and brooded over ambitions he never seemed able to accomplish. Downriver from the village at Salem's Port, where some folk tossed and burned with smallpox, the wealthy Jersey-born Philippe Langlois fumed in his counting-house over the nervous legislature's recent attempt to regulate French settlers in coastal towns. His wife Mary, meanwhile, who had her own head for business, closed up her dry goods shop in the corner of their fine new house, and went to supervise her kitchen and the large family of children, most of whom she, as lawful wife, had borne. Across the common, the aged Reverend John Higginson sighed over his books and worried about his sea-going sons, who had disappeared off Arabia, his daughter deserted by her husband, and the several years of back pay that his congregation owed him. Closer to the center of town, Reverend Nicholas Noyes studied the prophetic parts of Scripture, endlessly fascinated. Southward, where Boston's wharves bristled into the harbor, drunken songs rose from sailors' taverns as other businesses closed. Robert Califf turned the key on his textile shop and headed down the snowy street to gossip in his favorite coffee-house. Other merchants, like Samuel Sewell, a part-time judge, shut their ledgers and repaired to their families. Old John Alden, for all his estate, brooded on how best to pay the ransom for his son and colleagues held hostage by the French in Acadia. More anonymously, the orphaned hired girl Mercy Short, who now ladled stew in her employer's kitchen, had herself endured a Canadian captivity that haunted her still. In his North End study, lamplight revealed the young minister Cotton Mather, who continued to write and to blow his nose, still in the grip of a winter-long cold. All the responsibilities of a large congregation rested on him in the absence of his colleague and father, Increase Mather, currently in England, to negotiate with the king for the restoration of a charter for Massachusetts. Also in London, seeking advancement, was Maine-born Boston trader William Phipps, half pirate, his enemies said, half politician. Northeast from Massachusetts Bay, Reverend George Burroughs of Wells, Maine, having escaped prior wrangles in Salem Village, sat in his parsonage, which also served as the local garrison, with his children and a third apprehensive wife, and felt, perhaps as did others on the coast, secure from frontier attack as long as the snow lay deep enough. For France and England continued to spar over territory, and their respective colonies were mired in King William's War. Up country, unknown to the English settlers, Canadian soldiers advanced on snowshoes, French woodsmen and their Algonquin allies, armed by Quebec with attack orders from the Sun King at Versailles. The forest also sheltered scattered Algonquin families in hungry winter camps. Harried from their planting and fishing grounds, some took hostages and sold them to the French for money and supplies, or traded them to the English for their own captured kin. But none of this would be news to a devil who could look upon them all. Farmers, fishermen, and housewives, the loving and the loveless homes, the neighborly and the quarrelsome, the comfortable and the wretched. With his slightest nudge, they would prove with deadly certainty to have more in common than they thought. Introduction. Part 1. A New Approach. Mr. Burroughs, I will not write in your book, though you do kill me. Mercy Lewis. This volume offers a key to the mystery of the Salem witch trials, one of American history's favorite stereotypes of intolerance and superstition, a tragedy with popular associations of magical evil and Halloween jokes. This day-by-day narrative of events in their proper sequence unfolds the causes and effects of what really happened. The extensive notes provide a key for those who wish to verify sources and to investigate further. For although these trials are often treated as a symbol and a byword, they were real events involving real people, not history's scapegoats and whipping boys. Rather than argue a single theory to explain the tragedy, this book tells what happened to the people who lived through the events. It presents the story as a whole, and tells it from scratch, using original sources whenever possible. It does not hope to include everything, for some facts vanished unrecorded. It does augment contemporary accounts of the trials and their related problems with records of the courts and legislature, by wills, deeds, and letters, by almanacs and artifacts, by tide tables and the shape of the land itself. Some sources contradict, but often one obscurity explains another. Because this is a story, spelling and punctuation are standardized to maintain narrative flow. Dates appear as they were recorded in the old style, when the year began on March 25th and was 11 days behind, used before England's 1752 adoption of the Gregorian calendar, but begin the year in January as contemporary almanacs did. 3 asterisks indicate approximate dates in the narrative. Europe's Inner Demons, Norman Cohn's study of European witch hunts, firmly states that no testimony that includes fantastic elements may be taken in any way to indicate actual events. This book more closely follows Sherlock Holmes's advice to exclude the impossible and assume the rest, no matter how improbable, is real. Some of the afflicted faked their symptoms, though whether consciously or unconsciously is an open question, and a few other witnesses were reputed liars. But unless otherwise indicated, material here presents what people believed happened on the occasions described. Mercy Lewis, for example, said that when she saw the apparition of Reverend George Burroughs on the evening of May 7th, 1692, he threatened and tortured her because she refused to declare her allegiance to him by signing her name in his book, a volume she had never seen in his study when she used to work for him. Thomas and Edward Putnam deposed that they had been present when this happened, had heard her side of the conversation, and had feared Mercy's limbs would be disjointed as she shouted, "Mr. Burroughs, I will not write in your book, though you do kill me." From this testimony I do not deduce that Reverend Burroughs did any such thing, but neither do I assume that Mercy and the Putnams invented the testimony. I accept that Mercy experienced violent seizures on May 7, 1692, that the Putnam brothers saw only the writhing girl but no specters, and that Mercy thought she saw Burroughs. I also surmise that she had worked for him earlier and that he owned a number of books. Because the confessions were coerced from the suspects, any details that they include are as likely to refer to the magistrate's leading questions as to any actual events, although some seem to repeat current gossip. I do not think that the accused were witches, although a few may have acted as cunning folk even while they considered themselves Christian. The pin-riddled dolls reputedly found in Bridget Bishop's house were not necessarily hers. Many in the general population engaged in fortune-telling and counter-magic. Considering human nature, someone must have at least tried to perform malevolent magic, but there is no proof of it. Nor is there evidence of witchcraft the religion as it is practiced today. In 1692, the accused described witchcraft with as much loathing as the courts. Only Abigail Hobbs spoke before the trials of her allegiance to the devil, though she later denied it, and modern witches don't acknowledge a devil. To avoid confusion, witch capitalized within a sentence refers to the religion, while small case witch refers to every other meaning. Part 2. The Visible and Invisible Worlds. It were hard to some witches to take away life either of man or beast, yet when they once begin it, then it is easy to them. John Godfrey. Except for the obvious fact that, as with witchcraft suspects everywhere, New England's accused were mostly women, the Salem cases are not easily explained. 2 of the men executed in 1692 were suspected wife-beaters. Some of the accused women were viragos, others visible saints. A few were noticeably eccentric, but so were some of the afflicted. Some practiced folk magic, yet so did some of the accusers. The whole was briared in confusion. The witch scare flared up in New England, where British settlements clustered along the coast and up the major rivers. Beyond lay a largely unknown continent that could astonish the English with a moose or a merman, a place with more passenger pigeons in it than people, and more unseen spirits, the people knew, than pigeons. Even the most secular and cynical knew that they did not fully grasp or even imagine the extent of this world's wonders. The majority accepted that it was all under the watchful eye and hand of Providence, God's active presence, with order and purpose in every part. The orthodox Puritan churches had come to New England to conduct their lives in the way they felt God required, undisturbed by kings, bishops, or enthusiasts of other sects. The Orthodox view shared much that was common to the rest of the world's religions, the reality of spirit, to Christianity, original sin, to Protestantism, souls answerable to God directly, to Calvinism, the inability of some to ever attain salvation, and to English Puritanism in general, a covenant between themselves and God. They took their conscious part in the long stream of history that they saw flowing from Eden to a final judgment, when all designs and purposes would be clear at last. Until then, they knew, hell begrudged their attempt at a God-fearing society, and rejoiced more at the corruption of one New England lamb than the easy conquest of a London rake. While the state of one's soul was vitally important, the earthly work needed to keep a body and soul together between harvests was long and hard, and not all took religion constantly to heart. Even the most pious were capable of happiness common to other less devout mortals. They enjoyed their victuals, liked a good scarlet cloak if they could afford it, got carried away at harvest frolics, and indulged in rough-house after musters when whole neighborhoods turned out to picnic. They played musical instruments, though not during religious services, and sang. Farmers' sons danced competitive jigs against each other, and even ministers bowled at ninepins in the garden. Whether they thought much about it or not, the people, like the scientist Sir Isaac Newton, knew that the visible physical world about them was balanced by the invisible world of spirit, where the soul would dwell after the body's death. Angels traversed both worlds and swarmed about outnumbered humanity as thickly as mosquitoes. The good sought to protect and advise, the evil to terrify and corrupt. For although created sinless, they, like humanity, had the free will to choose wrong, and some of them had embraced evil. Too proud to tend younger, more highly favored humanity, those angels let resentment fester until some plotted even against God. They failed, and God cast them from heaven to languish chained in darkness. This imprisonment was, as Increase Mather reminded his Boston congregation, metaphorical. It signified the misery of their loss, a spiritual exile from God, which, however, they were too stubborn to regret or repent of. Even in their fallen state, rebel angels, more properly called devils, retained many powers, including knowledge of the future. They whispered evil ideas to unwitting victims' minds, or appeared before them in any deceitful guise, a fly, a hog, a shining angel, or a long-time friend. One devil disguised itself as a noted minister and gave progressively bad advice to a certain man in England until the listener tried to touch its arm and found no tangible substance. The rebel leader was identified as Lucifer, bringer of light, now called Satan, adversary. Although some spoke as if Satan were nearly a counterpoint to God, the Puritans generally regarded him as a general to an eager army. "When we speak of the devil," said Cotton Mather, "'tis a name of multitude. It means not one individual devil, but it means a kind, which a multitude belongs unto." Mortals knew no wickedness was too great for spirits devoid of mercy or self-restraint. But while a devil's abilities were obviously far greater than mankind's, they were also obviously far less than the power of God. The thorniest problem lay in the knowledge that, while devils delighted to plague people, God was ultimately in charge. Therefore God, in effect, allowed devils to inflict these trials. God, after all, permitted some mortals to savage the innocent. Why, people wondered, were some endowed with grace, a vital spiritual quality as arbitrary and absolute as perfect pitch, while others were predestined to damnation? Why did one 3-year-old Holyoke twin drown in a well, and the other live to be president of Harvard? Certainly God had plenty of reason to punish erring humanity, but the cause and effect of suffering were not always clear. "Shall we receive goods at the hands of God?" Job had asked, "and shall we not receive evil?" Meaning evil as an unhappy punishment rather than a moral wrong. Since God's providence worked through nature, even natural woes could be a warning to the incautious, a punishment to the sinful, or a test to the godly. Because the actions of individuals affected not only their own lives, but the lives of their families and the community, everyone shared the consequences of wrong acts. The recommended response to ill fortune was to search one's fallible soul for defect or complacency and amend the fault, whether as an individual or, if necessary, as a community. The reasons for such manifestations of providence could be obscure, unfathomable, and the frequent subject of debate. Puritan and non-Puritan alike noticed their neighbor's misfortunes, a lame horse or a dead child, and wondered if this were God's punishment. With good and evil so obviously present in the world, to question the devil's reality was to doubt God's. Few doubted. Since there was a devil, it followed that some wicked or foolish mortals would pay allegiance to him in return for maleficium, the power to work evil magic. Some cultures assumed maleficium was a naturally deadly quality like venom, counteracted only by the witch's death. Despite a persistently similar folklore, it was theologically inconsistent in the Christian West to think mortals made magic. Only disincarnate angels could produce such effects, and only evil angels would. Therefore, contemporary scholars argued, devils performed the magic for the witches, who either consciously collaborated or were deluded into thinking they did it themselves. Most notions about witchcraft came from folklore and predated the religious, legal, and scientific explanations the 17th century used to make sense of what everyone knew happened. Witches, they knew, were basically envious, resented their neighbors' successes, and enjoyed their misfortunes. Consequently, witches pilfered supplies at a distance or spoiled them from spite. They maimed, maddened, or killed livestock. They hurt or killed people by sudden disaster or slow illness. Witches worked their harm in person under an excuse of neighborliness. They trailed invisibly by casting a spell of confusion to prevent others from seeing them, or stepped from their own unconscious bodies to travel in spirit only. They might fly, using an ordinary stick as a steed, steal the neighbor's horse, or harness the neighbor himself with a magic bridle to reach their meetings. They were shapeshifters who changed their forms in the same way that they managed invisibility. But they also had familiar spirits, imps, in animal guise, and it was often difficult to distinguish a witch from her familiar. Witches could also cast charms from a distance. They burnt a wisp of roof straw to set a house afire, or toyed with a basin of water to sink ships. They tied knots in cords to bind all manner of bodily functions, stabbed cloth or wax images, or worked on actual pieces of their victims, hair or nail parings, because the scraps still contained the target's vital spirits. Even a witch's glance was thought to transmit spectral poison due to the ancient worldwide notion of the evil eye. People might become witches by a deliberate compact with the devil, or they could slide into witchcraft by using folk methods like counter-magic and fortune-telling. Since these little sorceries were magic, they attracted devils like flies to carrion. Devils also made trouble without invitation. Their harassed targets might, Cotton Mather speculated, cooperate just to be left in peace. A bad decision, he thought, but not as culpable as premeditated allegiance. Witches were considered to be anti-Christian, against all good, really, rather than simply non-Christian. The only real pagans were the unconverted native tribes. The settlers, Puritan and non-Puritan alike, spoke of them as worshipping the devil, but tended to assume, with cultural bias, that these people didn't know any better and had been deceived into thinking that lying devils were gods. Although powwows, shamans, were called witches, none was formally accused. Any mortal might be a witch. Men, women, and children from 4 to 80 were arrested, but nearly all suspects were women. Most female defendants were middle-aged or older, usually past childbearing, but with few or no children in a culture that valued large families. Their risk of conviction increased with their age and worsened in widowhood or desertion. Although most were acquitted, they were often still half suspected and put under expensive bonds for good behavior. Except for a few loners, men were usually suspected in association with their wives during the more virulent panics. Braggarts who claimed magical powers denied those claims in court, where they were fined and punished for lying. Their denials, unlike the women's, believed. Children, except for a few teenage daughters assumed to be their mothers' apprentices, were suspected only during the few larger outbreaks. At such times, people feared not just a particular suspect, but the possibility of an organized conspiracy. Surviving records indicate that more than 120 individuals, 88 women and 32 men, were suspected of witchcraft in New England between 1638 and 1691, excluding those who turned out to be only Quakers. Some suspects were in court repeatedly, and others not at all. Some 121 trials involved 85 women and 36 men. Of these, 38 cases were slander suits brought against an accuser by 27 women and 11 men. Spotty records for the 83 actual witch trials resulted in 11 to 17 executions, 1 or 2 of them of men, plus 3 guilty verdicts reversed, 2 women and 1 man. Most cases occurred in Connecticut and Massachusetts, where the majority of the English population lived. The rate of accusation in Essex County, Massachusetts, whose county seat is Salem, was the same as in Essex County of Old England, where most of the families hailed from. But sparsely settled Hampshire County in the Connecticut River Valley had more accusations per head than anywhere else in Massachusetts. The majority of Massachusetts's people clustered in Suffolk and Middlesex counties, and produced only 1/3 of the known cases, but all of the pre-1692 executions. That all capital cases were tried at Boston may have affected the fates of local suspects, since the Boston magistrates would have been more aware of established local suspicions, but not all the original records have survived. By the 17th century, Western witch lore included powers formerly applied to nature spirits, like spectral butter theft, or any menstruating woman, a glance that tarnished mirrors or dried-up mother's milk, plus the even then outdated medieval view of woman's nature, grasping and destructive. Western religion has usually been blamed for this situation, but while its forms have tended toward male authority and metaphor, the matter is more complicated than that. The pagan Mesopotamian world, where Judaism began, worshipped the goddess Ishtar at the same time it feared ferocious bird-like spirit women who attacked sleeping children. The Roman author Apuleius, himself a practicing magician sarcastic toward Christianity, included foolish women working their maleficium, as well as an exalted description of the goddess Isis in his first-century novel, Metamorphosis. Pagan Rome, which accepted most foreign cults, still condemned sorcerers to be burnt or torn apart by wild animals. Literature's stereotyped witch, like Canidia in Horace's Satires, was well established before the Judeo-Christian tradition took effect. But why accusers thought themselves at risk from specific suspects is not always clear in the surviving documents. Even the most copious notes did not include every meaningful glance or words left unsaid, much less the clashing personalities that could give whole new meaning to otherwise innocuous events. A reputation for witchcraft was no small burden for a suspect. The more
Sample complete. Ready to continue?